Hi, I'm Lindsay Preston. Happy 2021. We're back here for Story Mantra, and we're so excited to be here. I'm here with my co-host, Anju Gattani, and we are really excited to have as our first guest of the year, Lainey Cameron. She is the author of The Exit Strategy, which is an award-winning bestseller on Amazon, and we're so excited to have her here.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us on Story Mantra. The whole reason why we do this is because I wish someone had done these videos for me when I was learning. And super excited because we have Lainey with us, who was a debut 2020. Her book came out last year and she's going to talk to us more about that. But before she talks about her book, I'm going to talk about Lainey. So I've met Lainey online, on Zoom, so many different places, and I absolutely love her. She is the most interesting person because she doesn't just help herself, she helps other writers. She's an advocate for authors. She's an advocate for writers. She does a lot of support on Facebook and also outside of Facebook with the Women's Fiction Writers Association. She is every writer's best friend. So let me just start a little bit with her astounding background. Lainey Cameron is an author of women's fiction and a recovering tech industry executive, which is, hint, hint, a huge, huge bonus for the book and where it stems from. Her award-winning novel, The Exit Strategy, is a #1 Amazon bestseller. It was inspired by a decade of being the only woman in the corporate boardroom. I can't even imagine that. It's been called a rallying call for women to believe in themselves and join together. And if you haven't already got the book, you know, if you can.
Here you go.
See the cover. Yes, I have too much light here. Lady, could you hold your book up?
There we go. Always so fun. The camera is in reverse, right? There you go. That way.
Thank you. So we saw the gorgeous book cover, which is why whenever you read that book, you want to have a cup of coffee right by you. It's been called a rallying call for women to believe in themselves and join together. A digital nomad, Lainey is an avid Instagrammer and a proud member of the Women's Fiction Writers Association. She believes community makes the author's life worthwhile. And I'm a complete believer in everything that she does because I've seen her in action. Her awards and accolades. The Exit Strategy, which is Lainey's debut, is a 3-time award winner. So her book came out in the summer and I saw this. It just started getting awards one after the other. Something has to be in that book to make you want to pick it up and snap it open. It's a gold medal 2020 Reader's Choice Awards for women's fiction, a finalist in 2020 Best Book Awards by the American Book Fest, and The Exit Strategy has been chosen as a notable indie for 2020 by Shelfbound. It's a #1 Amazon bestseller in feminist books. Welcome, Lainey, and thank you so much for launching 2021 with us.
Yay! Oh, I'm so excited. This is, I think, my first interview of the year. So I'm so excited to be here with the two of you.
Yay!
We're so glad to have you. Thank you.
And this is also my first day back in my office in Mexico. You can see this beautiful space here. As Anju said, I'm a digital nomad and normally I'm traveling all over the place, but with COVID, we're having to hunker down in one place. So we've decided our house, we had a rental in Mexico, is where we are. And we've been here since more or less since March last year, except for one trip to go see my mother over the holidays.
No, that's your bonus trip for the year, I guess, to begin with.
Yeah, so you're joining me in quarantine because I just got back. So I will not be leaving the house for 2 weeks.
All right, Lindsay, what are we going to start with?
Well, I think right now we should probably start talking about your book. I mean, you came out big. This was your debut book.
That's
and
right.
You came out and kind of hit like a big, huge goal that everyone wants, is to be a bestseller. So I'm going to start off with asking you, what did you do to get there? And what do you credit with your success?
Oh gosh. Not taking no for an answer. The publishing business, we all know it's full of rejection, right? And it's a really fine balance between you're learning a new craft, right? So I just learned to become a novelist over the last 5 years. What's unusual is this is actually my first book as well as my debut. Most people's debut novels are not their first books. And I think this is a big misperception out there that someone sits down, they take a year, they take a month during NaNoWriMo, they write a book, they edit it for a month, they send it off to an agent, the agent says yes, they get a big publisher and ta-da. You know, most people's debuts are not their debut. So if you look at someone like Alison Hammer, who's also a 2020 debut, her book, You, Me, and Us, which is a fabulous book, big publisher book, got all the PR, also coming in for awards soon. That book was not her first book. She actually worked for almost 20 years on her first book, and that was her second book. And so I think there's this misperception, and I answer the question about my book this way because I don't want people to think that the average is you write one book, you sell it, that's how it works. Now, I was determined not to give up on this particular book because I felt like it was good enough by the time I was finished. But that was a 5-year journey on one book, 5-year, almost full time on one book to get it to the point that I knew that it was good enough. And I must have rewritten this book 10 times from when I started. And when I say rewritten, I don't mean like tweaked and like moved a chapter or two around. I mean like rewritten. And I worked with a developmental editor over a year and rewrote it 3 times in that 1 year working with a developmental editor. So I'm super happy that it's out there. I'm super happy that it's getting good reception. And I feel honored that I was able to do that with my first book because it is a bit unusual to achieve that, but also it wasn't an easy thing, right? Almost 5 years working on one book, rewriting it that many times. And the path to getting this thing published was not a straight line path. So going back to that example of people think, you know, you finish your book, you send it off, an agent picks it up, a big publisher says yes. And I know everybody knows it's hard, but that aperture to go through a big publisher is actually pretty small. There's a very limited number of books that get published by the 5 big publishers in a year. That very soon it'll be 4 big publishers.
Yeah.
So there's very few books. Like if I look at last year in women's fiction, and I'm very familiar with this because I'm very active with a group called the 2020 Debuts, which is the debut authors. Anju is part of this, who came out last year.
And everybody, you should know, Lainey is phenomenal on that group. I can't speak for anybody except her and Alison Hammer, who've taken that book, that entire Facebook group by the horns and steered us all forward. She's incredible. She really is. Like I said, she's every author's best friend.
So where I was going with that, and this is how Anju and I know each other, which is fabulous, and women's fiction writers. But where I was going with that is like, when I look at that, I started counting it yesterday because I was trying to advise another writer. And I think it's less than 10, it may be even less than 5 true women's fiction debut novels that came out last year from the big 5 publishers. There's a lot of suspense. I see a lot of domestic suspense, but true women's fiction where it's about the woman's emotional journey and it's not also a suspense novel or a sci-fi or a romance or a rom-com, there's not very many. And so I try to be realistic with people that that's actually a smaller aperture than people think it is. And agents are looking at that path alone to sell your book. Okay, most agents, 99 out of 100, are only looking to sell your book to big publishers or mid-tier publishers. And so they're going to look at it from that angle of, can I sell this book to a big publisher? That's how they look at it. And the way they judge that is they look at past performance. And they do believe that past performance is an indicator of future success. So this is where comps come in, comparable titles. An agent says, what's a comparable title? And they're using that to judge whether they can sell your book. So when I went out to agents with this book, which is set in the workplace, it's women's fiction set in the workplace. And I'll give you a quick pitch so you know what it's about. It's about 2 women who find themselves in an extraordinary circumstance where one is the wife and she just closed the deal of her career. She's invested everything in this company and she walks into the meeting to close the deal, sign the paperwork, and finds herself across the negotiating table from her husband's mistress. So it's a little high concept in that it's got a lot of fireworks at the beginning, but ultimately it's a book about friendship and it's set in the workplace. Well, the agents, when they look at that book, they say, can I see another book that's about friendship set in the workplace that's women's fiction? And there really wasn't a comp title out there. And so what happened is I was getting this feedback from agents like, I love your book. It's a page turner. I really enjoyed it. I'm not going to offer representation. Now, this was fairly far down the path after I'd revised it and I'd been through multiple rounds of feedback. And at this point, I'd actually queried 2 years in a row. I queried and then I stepped back and I revised it for a year. And then I queried again. And at this point, I knew it wasn't the book itself that was the problem because I'd had a lot of feedback. So that wasn't me just being like big-headed, like, I think my book's awesome, which is a danger. But that was like, okay, I've had a lot of feedback.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So when you got all this feedback, and you've rewritten this book countless times by then, and you've like you said, you stepped back, you took a look. how did you know what aspect to revise? Because as you said, it wasn't tweaking it or moving a chapter here and there. How did you know what to revise to bring it to that level?
Good question.
Because clearly you wrote a great book.
So I went through 2 rounds of querying. So one was like in 2018. Actually, what happened is the book won an award. It won an award for unpublished fiction from women's fiction writers. It came second in the Rising Star Awards. And I'd revised it and I thought it was ready. But that time when I queried, I was getting really contradictory feedback. I love Neil Gaiman says, don't look at what people say. Don't look at exactly what people say, look at where they pointed. And this is a perfect example of that. So one agent would say, I love Rin, but I don't like Carly. The next agent would say, I love Carly, but I don't like Rin. The next agent would say, I like both your characters, but something's not quite right. And then the next agent would say, I hate both your characters. So like it was completely contradictory, okay? But Neil Gaiman's thing is like, okay, what if you look at where they pointed, every single agent pointed at character. So I had a problem with character, but I didn't know what it was. And certainly that feedback wasn't helpful with working out what it was. And that's when I turned to a developmental editor because I needed someone smarter than me who could take that feedback and actually diagnose what exactly needed work. Because I was lost at that point. I'd lost sight of like, even my beta feedback wasn't giving me anything helpful. They were like, we like the book, it's good to go. The agents were like, there's a character problem, but I don't know what it is. So that's where I went with an amazing developmental editor called Tiffany Yates Martin, and she helped diagnose it and really point to what the problem was.
Wow.
And then I revised again and again.
Wow. I mean, I don't even know how, I mean, I've been through that whole revision process, so I completely understand where you're coming from. How did you feel when you got those rejections? Because that's something very few people really talk about, especially the ones where everybody's telling you something's not right, but agents are not telling you exactly what's right. And did you get 2 or 3 which were the same?
Yeah, so like I said, I went through 2 rounds of querying, and the first round of querying, although it was disheartening to hear my book wasn't ready, at least I had some feedback on what wasn't, like, even though it was hard to understand what to do with it, I knew there was work that still needed to be done. And I was excited to go do that work. So I saw it as a gift that I was getting some feedback, even if it was contradictory. And now I just needed to work out what to do with it. So yes, the first time it was demoralizing. And I got some great tips from some amazing writers on how to deal with that, which I'd be happy to share. But the second time around, I queried 130 agents and I got like 40 odd full manuscript requests, and every single one was a no. So the second time around, that would have been heartbreaking if not for the fact that I'd been given some amazing advice by April Eberhardt, who's an expert on paths to publication. And her advice was, know your plan A. Give plan A 6 months and be ready to move to plan B. And know your plan B before you give up on plan A. So my plan B was small publishers, and I'd thought through all the different options. I'm happy to talk about that, but I decided the best plan B for me, if I didn't get a bite from agents, was I was going to go with a small publisher, or at least I was going to try applying to small publishers. So by the time I got to 6 months, I had all of these rejections racked up. By the time I got there, and actually I had a really nice thing happen, which is I got an offer from an agent and I used that to close them all out. It actually wasn't an agent I wanted. It was an agent who made me an offer, and I said, it's been almost 6 months. I've got all these fulls sitting out there. I'm probably going to have those full manuscripts sitting for another 6 months, and I'll be stuck here not knowing the answer, and it could be no. So I used the agent that offered to go back to all the other agents and say, hey, I've got an offer on the table. I'm giving you 2 weeks. Can you let me know? And I got no from everybody. And that was like, wow. But I still didn't go with that agent that wasn't the right fit for me, because it's worse to have the wrong advocate than to have no advocate. You do not want an agent who is not a fit for you. I've seen it happen too many times to other authors. And so it would have been demoralizing. It would have been the kind of thing, and I don't want to minimize it and say like, rejection hurts, right? Every time you open your inbox, you're like, oh my God, am I not good enough? Is this not good enough? But I had 2 amazing pieces of advice. One was Laura Drake, who said to me, also an amazing mentor to authors. She said, you are not your book. So you need to really be able to separate that what they're talking about is a thing you created. They are not talking about you. They are not talking about your skills or your potential, right? Like, it's just like failing a test in high school. If you fail a math test, it doesn't mean you're a bad person. It means you failed that particular test. And so she gave me that advice. You've got to really separate yourself from your book. And then the second thing is, once I got those rejections, I was ready to go with plan B. I had my 6 small publishers that I wanted to apply to. I was at my 6-month mark and I got all those no's and I sent them off the next day.
Wow. That's just making me stop and think in terms of, it's not just any writer, it's every writer who goes through their own journey and their own little pathway. What really makes me think hard right now is, how did you say no to that agent, and how did you know she wasn't the right fit, or he wasn't the right fit?
It was a she, and I just looked at their agency background of selling a book like mine. Now, I just told you no one sold, there wasn't a similar comp. So I wasn't looking that they'd sold the exact same book as mine.
Yeah.
But like, what women's fiction had they sold? Had they sold it to the publisher I really wanted? I really wanted Amazon Publishing. That was very high on my list. So I wanted an agent who had sold to Amazon Publishing, or more specifically, Lake Union. And she'd never sold anything to Lake Union. So I'm like, okay, so she doesn't have the contacts at Lake Union. She's early in her career. I just didn't have confidence. And then there were a couple of emails back and forth where I just felt like, I think I asked to speak on the phone because I wanted to ask some of these questions. I thought, okay, I'll give her a chance to talk. And she just didn't want to get on the phone and talk. And I was like, that's not someone I'm going to work well with.
Wow. So those are the red signals that we read about, but you were lucky that you got that ahead of time, I would say. So you mean.
Yeah, and that I had so many amazing author friends who had taught me that you don't need an agent to take your book into the world. I actually met someone or talked to someone not long after my book came out who said to me, "How did you bring your book out without an agent? I didn't know that was possible." And I had kind of a moment of like, huh, really? But I think, people hear about self-publishing and they hear about big publishers and having an agent, and they don't realize there's many variations and many options within this, right? You can go
Right.
small publisher with an agent. You can go to some mid-tier publishers without an agent, which is what I did. I went to small publisher. So I think there's a misperception that the only way to bring your book into the world and be successful is to have a big publisher contract.
Wow. Well, I have another question. And after, 5 years of revising this book, polishing it to no end, and then to find out you're releasing in a pandemic, how did that all pan out for you?
I think I'm a glass half full kind of person. So I knew that community was going to matter even more, and that online events were going to matter. And the reality is, for a small publisher book, your small publisher book probably isn't going to be in bookstores anyway. Another misperception out there. Bookstores get to return their books to publishers. I think a lot of people don't really realize how this works. So bookstores have the ability to return their books. Small publishers generally cannot afford to let bookstores do unlimited returns. In fact, if you're a small publisher, that could put you out of business if you had a really successful book and every bookstore said, "I'll take 5,000," and then 2 months later they sent back 4,000. That could put your company out of business if you're a small publisher. And so it's not that they're being mean or stingy or anything like that. It's just a business model issue. Small publishers generally can't take unlimited returns or high levels of returns, and they may or may not offer the same discount. So most of the time, a small publisher book will not be in bookstores. Now, there are exceptions. You can make it happen as an author. You can go to your local bookstore. You can put books on consignment. So there are things you can do. But in that scenario where, for the most part, my book wasn't going to be in bookstores, it actually wasn't as big a deal that I was going to have to do it all virtually. And people were reading during the pandemic. People didn't stop reading. Even today, I'm reading like crazy. It's how I escape from the rest of the news. And so for me, I think it wasn't as negative a thing. It was more the fact that you're dealing emotionally with all the impact of like the world blowing up around us, and you're trying to keep going and actually keep your morale in terms of just keeping on with the launch activities. So I think it was more for me just trying to balance the reality of like, whoa, life is crazy and sucky and these things aren't good and friends are getting sick. And so it was more the personal aspect of being able to actually keep going. But in terms of my book launch, I don't feel like it made as big a negative difference as people imagined it might. I think for big publisher authors, it was very different. If your book was going to be in an airport bookstore, for example, or if your book was going to have a series of events at bookstores around the country, then it really had a much bigger impact. I think for me, I was really kind of on the lucky side of this.
Wow. Well, we've been really lucky to have Lainey. And I guess, Lindsay, you're going to nod and say time's up. I see you. Time's up. So do you want to wrap us up, Lindsay?
Yeah, so thank you so much for Lainey for joining us, and we look forward to having you back at our next week. And thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next week.